I go
Well,
to the
why did I
cemetery?
go to the cemetery?
Well, to see what was happening.
To see
I
what
went
was
to the
happening.
cemetery to see what was happening.
To see what was happening.
Who went to the cemetery
Who
to
went
see
to the
what
cemetery?
was happening?
To see what was happening.
Me, AJ, went to the cemetery to see what was happening.
To see what was happening.
Where was the cemetery?
Where was the cemetery? Cemetery.
In Guatemala. Right?
In
The
Guatemala.
cemetery was in Guatemala.
Guatemala.
What is
What
the Day
is
of the Dead?
the Day of the Dead?
A holiday. Right?
A
The
holiday.
Day of the Dead
The Day
is
of
a
the
holiday. When is the Day of the Dead?
Is the Day of the Dead.
November 1st.
November
The Day
1st.
of the Dead
The Day of the Dead.
was and is
What?
November
And it.
1st.
November 1st.
Okay.
Okay.
So I went to the cemetery
So I went to the
on the Day of the Dead
on the Day of the Dead
to see
to
what
see
was happening.
what was happening.
What I found
What I found
was quite interesting.
was quite interesting.
Was it
Was
boring?
it boring?
No, it wasn't boring.
It wasn't boring.
Was it interesting?
Was it interesting?
Yes. It was interesting. The cemetery was interesting.
Interesting.
How did I feel
How did I feel
about the cemetery?
about the cemetery?
I felt it was interesting. Or I thought it was interesting.
It was interesting.
Was it boring or was it interesting?
Interesting.
It was interesting. Of course, it was interesting. What was interesting? The cemetery. The cemetery was interesting.
Was interesting.
When was the cemetery interesting?
Was the cemetery?
It was interesting on the Day of the Dead.
Day of the Dead.
November 1st.
November 1st.
Okay, the atmosphere
Okay, the atmosphere
in the cemetery
was
like a party.
Like a party.
Was the atmosphere very sad?
Very sad.
No, the atmosphere was not sad. The atmosphere was like a party.
Like a party.
The atmosphere was very happy.
Very happy.
Was the atmosphere sad or happy?
Or happy.
The atmosphere was happy. The atmosphere was like a party.
Like a party.
What was like a party?
What was like a party?
The atmosphere in the cemetery was like a party.
Like a party.
Where was the atmosphere like a party?
Like a party.
In the cemetery.
The cemetery.
The atmosphere was like a party. In the cemetery. Was the atmosphere like a party at my house? No, not at my house. The atmosphere was like a party in the cemetery. The atmosphere was not like a party in my house. So the atmosphere was like a party. There were people everywhere. Families were sitting around the graves of their dead ancestors. Where were the families sitting? Around the graves right? They were sitting around the graves. Who was sitting around the graves? The families, right? The families were sitting around the graves.
Around the graves.
Were they sitting around the trees?
Around the tree?
No, they weren't sitting around the trees.
They were sitting around
They
the
were
trees.
sitting around the graves.
Around the graves.
So, where were they sitting?
Where were they sitting?
Around the graves.
Around the graves.
Families were sitting around the graves of their dead ancestors. Were they sitting around the graves of their dead ancestors?
Around the grave.
Yes. They were sitting around the graves of their dead ancestors. Were they sitting around the graves of their friends? No, not really. They were sitting around the graves of their dead ancestors. Who was sitting around the graves?
Who was sitting around the graves?
That's right. Families were sitting around the graves. Whose graves were they sitting around? Whose graves were they sitting around? Yes, their dead ancestors. Their ancestors. Their ancestors' graves. They were sitting around the graves of their dead ancestors. Were they sitting around the graves of their dead ancestors or the graves of their friends? Ancestors, right? They were sitting around the graves of their dead ancestors. They cleaned the graves and added fresh flowers. Okay. Who cleaned the graves? That's right, the families. What did they add?
What did they add?
They added fresh flowers.
Fresh flower.
Did they add food? No, they didn't add food. Did they add money? No, they didn't add money. They added fresh flowers. What did they clean? They cleaned the graves. Whose graves did they clean? Right? Their ancestors, right? They cleaned their ancestors' graves. Where did they add flowers? Where? Oh, they added flowers to the graves. That's right. They cleaned the graves and added fresh flowers. Very good. I walked through the cemetery and admired the beauty of all the colorful flowers. Where did I walk? Through the cemetery. I walked through the cemetery. Did I walk through the park? No, I didn't walk through the park. I walked through the cemetery. Where did I walk? Through the cemetery. Who walked through the cemetery? I did, AJ. I walked through the cemetery. Did I walk through the cemetery? Or did I walk through the park? I walked through the cemetery. That's right. And I admired the beauty of all the colorful flowers. Did I admire the beauty
Did I admire
of
beauty
the trees?
of the tree?
No.
No,
I
no.
didn't admire
I
the
didn't
beauty
admire the
of the
beauty
trees.
of the tree.
Did I admire
Did
the
I
beauty
admire beauty
of the children?
of the children?
No, I didn't
No, I
admire
didn't
the
admire
beauty
the
of the
beauty
children.
of the children.
What did I admire?
What did I admire?
The flowers, right? Yeah, I
Flower.
admired the beauty
The beauty
of all the colorful
of
flowers.
all the
Who admired the beauty of all the colorful flowers? That's right. AJ, me, admired the beauty of all the colorful flowers. Where were the flowers?
Where were the flower?
Yeah, on the graves, right? Or
On
in the
graves.
cemetery.
In the cemetery.
Right? The flowers were on the graves
On the grave.
in the cemetery.
In the cemetery.
Were the flowers
Were the flowers
in the park?
in the park?
No,
No.
they weren't in
They
the park.
In the park.
Were the flowers in
Were
my
the
house?
flower in my house?
No, they weren't in my house.
No, they weren't.
Where
in my
were
house.
the flowers? The flowers were